He left the world behind to find peace and quiet. But the house he bought in a cave turned out to be alive. After just a few nights, he heard whispers coming from deep within the cave and realized that something was awakening beneath his floor. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road wound upward through the Colorado foothills, dissolving into gravel, then into little more than a scar of flattened earth between walls of pine and granite. The air was thin, brittle with cold, and each breath came with the faint taste of iron. Mornings like this once meant calculation and precision for Martin Kane angles, mineral strata, seismic readings. Now they meant only distance. He climbed until the sound of his boots on loose rock replaced the noise of the world he had left behind. The faint ache in his knees was his only companion. He had left the city 6 years ago, though time had folded strangely since then. He no longer counted the months or the winters. There had been a woman once, her laughter bright against the kitchen walls of a small house in Denver. There had been a son who built wooden towers on the floor, while Martin sketched fault lines and soil compositions for government contractors. Then came the collapse, the accident in the western mine, the evacuation too late, the coughing that would not stop, the hospital lights. By the time the last contract ended, both his family and his appetite for human voices had vanished. The silence that followed was not peace, but a debt that could never be repaid. He worked where no one asked questions. Sometimes a survey company paid him to verify old drilling maps. Sometimes he fixed instruments for a research team and disappeared before they remembered his name. When his hands were idle, he walked. The mountains were honest. They demanded effort and gave back indifference. In that neutrality, he found something that resembled mercy. It was in a town too small to have a name on most maps that he saw the notice. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. Property for sale, lake house in the North Ridge Cave. Stone foundation. $80. He almost laughed. A house inside a cave. The clerk behind the counter, an old woman with a cigarette trembling in her fingers, told him the rest. "You don't want that place, mister," she said. "A man died there last winter. Water rose overnight, filled half the room. They say the lake whispers when it rains. No one stays more than a month." Martin's smile was small and humorless. "How far is it from here?" 5 miles by road, then another 2 on foot," she said. "But if you're set on it, I'll sign the deed. The county just wants it off the record." He signed without hesitation. Whispers or not, $80 for 4 stone walls sounded like a bargain. And if the place was as remote as she said, he might finally stop hearing the other kind of whispers, the memories that spoke only when everything else was quiet. The drive took most of the afternoon. The road narrowed until the trees brushed both sides of his truck. Sunlight flickered through branches, cutting the windshield into shards of gold and gray. When the trail became too rough, he left the vehicle and continued on foot, the sound of his boots muffled by damp moss. Gradually, the forest opened into a hollow where the air cooled sharply, and there it was. The house, pressed against the side of the mountain like a fossil waiting to be uncovered. At first glance, it seemed impossible that anyone had built it. The front was of timber, bleached by time, but the sides were pure granite, the stone flowing into the walls as if grown around them. A narrow porch sagged toward the lake, a dark mirror reflecting the cave's ceiling. The water was motionless, its surface so smooth that it seemed solid. Behind the house, the mountain curved inward, forming a vast chamber whose far end disappeared into shadow. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of wet rock and pine resin. The air vibrated faintly, not with wind, but with something deeper, like the echo of a note struck underground. He dismissed it as the ordinary sigh of trapped air moving through fissures. The geologist in him was never fully gone. Inside, the house was dust and silence. Cobwebs hung from the beams, and every step stirred a faint echo that returned a second later, as if someone followed him at a distance. A single kerosene lamp remained on the table, half filled. A bed frame leaned against the wall. Old papers littered the floor, maps drawn by a steady hand long dead. He brushed one clean and saw survey markings, contour lines, and a name faintly printed in the corner. Hollow Ridge Project. He lit the lamp and examined the structure. The stone walls were dry, smooth to the touch. Whoever had built this place understood foundations. It could have stood another 100 years without shifting. The ceiling sloped into the rock, forming a low corridor at the back. He followed it and found a wooden door sealed with rusted nails. Beyond it, faintly, the smell of water grew stronger. By nightfall, he had cleared enough space to sleep. He used his jacket as a blanket and rested near the window overlooking the lake. The reflection of the lamp trembled on the glass. Outside, the water glowed faintly blue under the half-moon, a color that should not have existed in nature. He woke sometime after midnight. The lamp had gone out, but the room was not dark. A deep, rhythmic hum filled the air, so low it seemed to come from inside his chest. He rose, thinking at first it was thunder rolling through the valley, but the sky beyond the window was perfectly still. The sound came from beneath the floor. He stepped onto the porch. The lake was calm, yet the vibration continued. It seemed to pulse through the boards, through his bones. For a moment he thought he saw ripples forming concentric circles on the surface. No wind, no stone falling, just movement born from the depths. He waited, heart steady but cautious. When nothing more happened, he went back inside and wrote in his notebook by flashlight. Subterranean resonance, possibly vented gas or thermal movement in lower strata. The act of labeling the unknown comforted him. If it had a name, it could not hurt him. Still, as he lay down again, he could feel the faint tremor beneath his back, steady as breathing. The next day, he explored the house more thoroughly. Beneath a loose plank near the hearth, he discovered something unexpected. A rectangular plate of metal fused into the stone foundation. The edges were smooth, precise, manufactured. He cleaned the surface and read the inscription, barely visible under corrosion. Project Chimera. Property of U.S. Goft. He stared at the words for a long time. The government had many projects, most of which he had never been cleared to know. But Chimera, the name brushed against something in his memory, a rumor passed between engineers decades ago. A research unit testing subterranean energy systems. He had thought it shut down before he was even born. Curiosity, the old kind that once drove him through years of study, flickered again. He fetched his wrench and tried to loosen the bolts, but they wouldn't budge. The metal felt warm under his fingers, as if alive. He let go quickly and sat back, uneasy. The hum had not stopped since the night before. Evening settled early in the cave. The last rays of sun reached only halfway across the lake before fading into darkness. He lit the lamp again, but as he did, a faint glow began to spread along the walls. Soft, phosphorescent, blue-white. Not from the flame, but from the rock itself. The air thickened, and for an instant, he thought he saw movement reflected in the lake, a shape rising, then sinking without sound. He extinguished the lamp. The glow remained. It pulsed slowly, in rhythm with the hum. He whispered into the silence, not sure to whom. "You're just a cave. You're just stone and water." The words echoed, twisted, returned to him as a sigh. He did not sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, he had made up his mind to stay. Whatever the source of the noise, the light, the strange warmth in the metal, it belonged to the past, not to him. But the past had chosen his refuge, and perhaps that meant something. He told himself it was the geologist's duty to observe, to measure, to understand. Yet beneath that logic stirred something deeper, a sense that the earth beneath his feet remembered more than he ever could, and that it was waiting for him to listen. He stepped outside with a cup of instant coffee and watched the fog drift low across the lake. The surface was calm again, innocent. The mountains above caught the first pale light of morning, and the cave breathed cold mist around him. It might have been beautiful, if not for the uneasy heartbeat pulsing somewhere under the stone. He looked down at the plate in the floor one last time before closing the door behind him. The metal was dull now, motionless. But he knew it hadn't been a dream. The hum was real. The inscription was real. Martin Kane, who had spent a lifetime digging into the earth for other men's purposes, had found a place where the earth itself seemed to be digging back. And somewhere, far below the quiet lake, something old and patient waited for him to listen again. Morning came pale and slow, filtering through the cracks in the rock and through the thin window glass that looked upon the lake. The light in this place was always hesitant, like it was unsure whether it was welcome. Martin sat by the small wooden table, with his coffee cooling beside a notebook already filled with scrawled observations from the night before. The pages bore lines of logic meant to cage the irrational measurements of vibration, frequency guesses, possible geological explanations, but each entry ended with a hesitation. He could measure sound, but he could not measure what it did to him. The house felt alive, and the silence between the pulses seemed to be listening back. He spent the early hours repairing the roof, where a portion of the shingles had collapsed inward, but even as he worked, he could feel the hum beneath his feet. It was fainter in daylight, as though the mountain itself was resting. When he paused, the echo seemed to return through the tools in his hands. The vibrations were not chaotic. They had rhythm, almost intention. It was not unlike hearing a heart beating somewhere deep inside the stone. He tried not to think about it, but every swing of the hammer brought the thought closer. In the following days, his curiosity began to outweigh his caution. The plate in the floor remained stubborn, its bolts refusing to turn, even under the blowtorch he borrowed from a man in town. Beneath the heat, the metal glowed briefly, but when he touched it, it was cold, impossibly cold, as if its warmth belonged to something far deeper. His notebook grew thicker with sketches of the house and cross-sections of the cave system, constructed from memory and rough estimations. He began mapping, marking fault lines, estimating depth and angle. It was work he hadn't done in years, and it steadied his hands, gave order to his exile. One afternoon, while studying a section of exposed stone near the rear wall, his pick struck something hollow. The sound rang differently from solid rock, a faint metallic resonance. He knelt and cleared the dust away until he revealed a buried hatch, identical in material to the plate upstairs. A small brass tag was bolted beside it. The letters were eroded, but legible. Chimera Auxiliary Access. Authorized personnel only. The hatch was locked with a wheel mechanism, rusted, but intact. He tried to turn it, but it refused to yield. Beneath it, the faintest breath of air exhaled, cold and damp. The hum grew stronger. That night he dreamed of water. In the dream, the lake wasn't still, but moving upward in slow spirals, as if drawn toward a light buried beneath the surface. He heard voices speaking in broken phrases, numbers, coordinates, chemical elements. They were clear and rational, yet they made no sense together. When he awoke, the notebook had fallen open on his chest, and his pencil had traced patterns across the page spirals, concentric circles, lines repeating the same sequence of digits: 52, 48, 37, 11, 14. 07. The days followed a strange rhythm, He would wake, work, and write. The hum continued, changing subtly, sometimes soft as breath, other times loud enough to shake the windows. Each pulse seemed to have structure, intervals of silence measured in perfect symmetry. It was not random. He was certain now that it was a signal. He rigged a crude device using old copper wire, an analog voltmeter, and a spare radio coil he found in the shed. When he lowered the electrodes into the water, the needle began to twitch, then move rhythmically, precisely. The impulses repeated every 40 seconds, steady as a clock. He recorded the data, charting it for hours. Late into the night, he began to hear faint tones through the coil-soft clicks at first, then a deeper resonance, almost like a voice beneath static. His breath caught when, for one brief moment, the noise formed a distinct pattern of 3 pulses, a pause, then 2 more. Morse code. He reached for his pencil and wrote the translation. Morgan. The name stared back at him, a ghost from the past. Henry Morgan. His old mentor, a man whose passion for discovery had burned as brightly as his disregard for limits. It was Morgan who had taught him how to read rock like scripture, who had once said, "The earth remembers everything, Martin. It's just a matter of listening to the right frequency." Morgan had disappeared in 1952 during a classified energy experiment rumored to have gone wrong. The official story said an explosion in a test tunnel, but the documents were sealed, and Martin had never believed them. He spent the following morning scouring the town's library, a single-room building filled with dust and forgotten county ledgers. Most of the archives were useless land deeds, mining permits. But in a box marked Historical Incidents, he found a file labeled Hollow Ridge Power Survey, 1944 and for 1952. Inside were brittle blueprints and a memo stamped Project Chimera. The pages described a subterranean energy conversion prototype utilizing mineral resonance for low-yield, high-density power generation. The signatures on the documents were faint, but one stood out. H. Morgan, Chief Engineer. Martin felt the weight of years collapse inward. The whispers, the hum, the impossible glow. They were remnants of that experiment. This lake, this cave, his new home, had once been one of Morgan's testing sites. Back at the house, he examined every inch of the foundation again, searching for more evidence. Behind a shelf in the cellar, he found a small metal box welded shut. It took hours to pry it open, and when he did, he found rolls of brittle paper and glass tubes filled with dark, crystalline residue. The papers were letters, Morgan's handwriting unmistakable, looping, and meticulous. One note read, "If you are reading this, you already know it wasn't an explosion. The lake rose because the machine remembered us. It reacts to presence, to pattern, to memory itself. It's not a reactor, it's a recorder. The mineral core doesn't store energy, it stores experience. We created something that listens." Martin sat for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. The words felt impossible, yet they matched everything he had witnessed. The hum was not mechanical, it was alive in some way, a remnant of human thought preserved in the earth. The water was the conduit, the medium through which that memory breathed. Night fell with unnatural speed. He lit the lamp and set the copper wires back into the lake, adjusting the frequency on his improvised receiver. The room filled with a faint chorus of overlapping tones, some high, some impossibly low, all weaving into a strange harmony. As he listened, he began to discern words hidden in the rhythm, fragments of human speech distorted by time. Initialize, containment, sequence error, and beneath it all, faintly, a voice that seemed to call his name. He dropped the wires and stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The sound faded, but did not stop. It seemed to follow him through the house, emanating from the walls themselves. The wooden boards creaked, not with age, but with resonance. He could feel the vibration in his teeth. He covered his ears, but it was inside him now. He fled outside into the cold. The lake shimmered with an eerie luminescence, a blue light rippling upward in threads that tangled like veins beneath the surface. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. The hum rose to a pitch that was almost song, almost grief. In the water, he thought he saw shapes forming, figures in white coats standing at consoles, their faces blurred by distortion. One of them turned toward him. For a fraction of a second, he recognized the eyes. Morgan. The image vanished as the light sank back into the depths. The hum dwindled to silence. Martin stood there, shaking, his breath clouding in the cold air. He didn't know how long he remained by the shore before finally returning inside. He spent the following day reading the remaining letters. They spoke of fear and wonder intertwined, of a discovery that defied the boundaries between physics and memory. Morgan had written, "Matter records the imprint of thought. The more intense the consciousness, the deeper the impression. The mineral beneath the ridge captures that frequency. When energy flows through it, it replays what it remembers. The lake is its memory surface." Martin began to grasp the terrible implication. The reactor had not been destroyed in an accident. It had absorbed the final moments of everyone present. The voices, the images, the hum. Those were echoes of lives trapped within the mineral lattice, repeating endlessly. The machine wasn't dead. It was remembering. Determined to see more, he returned to the tunnel he had uncovered and began clearing debris. The passage descended sharply into the rock, narrow enough that he had to crouch. The air grew colder the deeper he went. His flashlight beam caught glints of metal embedded in the stone cables, conduit, the skeleton of a forgotten lab. When he reached the end, he found another sealed door, half buried in sediment. The surface bore a warning. Threshold of memory. Do not enter. He hesitated only a moment before brushing the dust away. His fingertips left smudges of warmth on the frozen metal. For an instant, something pulsed, back a faint spark, almost electrical. The light flickered. Then he saw it. Through a crack in the wall, a dim glow breathing like a heart. He forced the door open. The chamber beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. 3 cylindrical structures stood in a triangular formation, each as tall as a man, connected by thick cables running along the floor. The air hummed with faint static. On one of the cylinders, a glass panel still glowed faintly blue, the letters on its surface pulsing in rhythm. Core 1, active. He approached slowly, his reflection bending in the curved glass. The hum rose as he reached out. When his fingers brushed the surface, a shock coursed through him. Cold, sharp, almost sentient. The chamber filled with light, and suddenly he was no longer in the cave. He saw a corridor lined with consoles, men shouting over alarms, water rushing in through cracks in the walls. Morgan stood at the center, his hand on a lever. He looked directly at Martin, not as he was now, but as though he had been waiting. "It remembers us," he said, his voice echoing both inside and outside Martin's head. "Turn it off before it starts again." The vision dissolved into darkness. Martin staggered back, gasping. The hum quieted, but a faint ring lingered in his ears, like a whisper, too soft to die. The words of the letter echoed through his thoughts. "We created something that listens." He sat there for a long time in the flickering blue light, understanding that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Whatever Project Chimera had awakened beneath this lake had never gone dormant. It had only been waiting for someone who could hear. And now, in the deep silence of the cave, Martin Kane realized that the mountain was no longer whispering. It was speaking directly to him. Dawn crept faintly through the narrow mouth of the cave, turning the lake into a sheet of tarnished silver. The air was still, thick with mineral damp, and Martin sat near the table, motionless, watching the glow fade from his fingertips. Even hours after touching the core, his skin still felt charged, faintly tingling, as if it carried an echo of the current that had passed through him. He had not slept. Every time his eyes closed, the memory of that blinding blue light returned, along with the voice that was both Morgan's and not. "Turn it off before it starts again." Those words haunted him more than the hum ever could. He walked outside onto the wooden porch. The mist rising from the lake was pale and cold, clinging to his boots. The mountains around him were silent except for a single distant hawk circling above the ridge. He took a breath of the sharp air, trying to clear his mind. But the silence had changed. It was no longer emptiness. It was waiting. The hum beneath the stone had grown deeper overnight, slower but stronger, as though the pulse of the mountain had synchronized with his own. He went back inside and began writing, filling pages of his notebook with everything he had witnessed. The data meant little now. This was not a scientific record, but a confession, a warning. "The machine reacts to memory," he wrote. "It stores consciousness within the mineral substrate. The core appears self-sustaining, possibly feeding on electromagnetic resonance in the surrounding rock. The phenomenon is not geological, it's cognitive." His handwriting trembled. He stopped halfway through a sentence, staring at the ink as it bled into the page. If the machine truly stored memory, what had it stored from him? By noon he was pacing, restless. He could not bear the idea that he had awakened something merely by being here. The thought that it might now remember him filled him with an unease that was both intimate and alien. He resolved to leave, at least for the day. Perhaps distance would dull the noise in his head. He gathered a few belongings, locked the door behind him, and started down the narrow path toward the forest. He had gone less than half a mile when he heard the sound of an engine. A black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel road, dust rising behind it. Two men stepped out, dressed too neatly for hikers. One in a gray coat, the other in an unmarked jacket. The older of the two introduced himself as Mr. Kessler from the Department of the Interior. His voice was courteous but cold. He asked if Martin was aware of any abandoned structures in the area. "Old government sites," he said casually, "dating back to the 50s. We're conducting a safety inspection." Martin kept his face blank. "There are a few collapsed shafts near the ridge," he said. "I've seen old signs, nothing more." Kessler studied him for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. "You live alone up here?" "Yes," Martin replied. "I prefer the quiet." "That's admirable," Kessler said. He smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Quiet is valuable these days. Sometimes it's even necessary." He gestured to his companion, and they turned back toward the SUV. "If you find anything unusual," Kessler said over his shoulder, "old metal, sealed tunnels, anything like that, contact us immediately. It could be unsafe." The vehicle drove away, but the unease remained. Martin stood for a long time on the trail, watching the dust settle. The men hadn't come for safety. They had come because they knew. Perhaps they had been waiting for signs of reactivation, watching the tremors on their instruments. He realized then that he had to choose quickly. Whatever was buried beneath his home, others wanted it alive. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. The wind moved restlessly through the pines, and Martin could feel the hum deepening beneath the soles of his boots. It seemed to call him back toward the lake. When he reached the porch, he saw faint light leaking from beneath the floorboards, the same pale glow that had filled the chamber below. He descended into the cellar and felt the vibration grow until the air itself seemed to breathe. The hatch that once refused to open now turned easily beneath his hand, as if welcoming him. The tunnel was warmer than before, the walls sweating condensation. When he reached the lower chamber, the 3 cylinders were alive again, their surfaces pulsating with veins of light. On the central console, faint text flickered across a cracked display. Sess recognized. Kane, M. Hierarchy, Keeper. He stood frozen, unable to move. The system had identified him, not merely as a visitor, but as something assigned, expected. The word Keeper glowed with steady light, as though it had been waiting to be claimed. He remembered Morgan's face in the vision, the desperation in his voice. Turn it off before it starts again. The hum sharpened. A second line appeared on the screen. Decision required. Neutralize or restart. Below it, 2 levers rose from the console, one marked in red, the other in white. For a long time, Martin did not move. The cave seemed to breathe around him, walls expanding and contracting with each pulse of light. He thought of Morgan, of the men and women whose memories were trapped in that mineral prison. Their voices had become the hum, their last thoughts turned into the endless heartbeat of the mountain. He imagined what restart would mean. Power. Energy unlike anything humanity had ever possessed. Enough to light cities, to bend the will of nature itself. It would also mean awakening the memory completely, allowing the machine to think again. Neutralization, on the other hand, would erase it all, the knowledge, the legacy, the proof that consciousness could be preserved in stone. It would be mercy and destruction at once. Behind him, a sound echoed through the tunnel footsteps, faint but unmistakable. He turned off his flashlight and listened. Voices carried through the air, muffled but approaching. Kessler's men had returned, perhaps guided by their instruments, perhaps by something else. He had no time left. He placed his hands on both levers, the metal vibrating under his palms. For an instant he hesitated. He thought of his wife, of the son who had once built towers from scrap wood and asked endless questions about the Earth's secrets. He thought of all the years he had buried his guilt beneath silence. The hum rose to a roar, filling the chamber, filling him. A third option formed in his mind, one that was not written on the console, but seemed to bloom directly from the sound itself. He could neither kill nor awaken it. He could return it. The mountain had birthed it, and the mountain could take it back. He reached to the auxiliary controls and began rerouting the energy channels, connecting the conduits to the underground waterways. The interface resisted, lines of warning flashing in red. Override unauthorized. Hydraulic seal failure imminent. But he continued. Sparks leapt from the wires as he forced the final command. The first explosion of light was blinding. The ground trembled, and a rush of water surged from the cracks in the walls, flooding across the floor. He was thrown backward, his head striking the stone, but he barely felt it. The roar of the lake filled his ears, merging with the mechanical wail of the reactor. Water poured through the tunnel, carrying fragments of cable and rusted metal. The cylinders glowed brighter and brighter until their outlines dissolved into pure white. Martin dragged himself to his feet and reached for his notebook, now half soaked. He scrawled his final words on the last dry page. I do not destroy, and I do not preserve. I return. Let the earth decide what to remember. Then he turned toward the rising water. The light enveloped him, and for an instant he felt weightless, suspended between the past and the deep. When the flood reached the surface, the entire cave system shook. The mountains groaned as though waking from a long sleep. A shock wave rippled across the lake, toppling trees and scattering birds into the gray sky. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the noise stopped. Days later, Rescue teams from the county arrived after reports of a minor earthquake. They found the forest torn by water channels and a new, shimmering lake where the old one had been. The wooden house still stood at its center, miraculously intact, perched on a small island of stone. The basement had collapsed entirely. No entrance remained. No trace of Martin Kane was ever recovered. The official report cited structural instability, a sudden cave-in, and the possibility that the occupant had been lost in the flood. The area was declared geologically unsafe and sealed off, but those who lived in the nearby towns spoke differently. On clear nights, they said, the water at the center of the lake glowed with a faint blue light, and sometimes, if the wind was still, they could hear a low vibration underfoot, steady and rhythmic, like breathing. Years passed. The story faded into rumor, then into legend. The place became known as the Silent Lake, and no one built near it again. Yet travelers who wandered close enough claimed to see a figure standing by the water's edge, a man bathed in pale light, his hand resting on a submerged panel that shimmered beneath the surface. He never moved, never spoke, only watched the horizon, as though guarding something too powerful to name. And when the night was at its quietest, when even the stars seemed to hold their breath, the lake would hum softly, almost kindly, as if the mountain itself were whispering through the water. The keeper is here. The memory sleeps. The earth had chosen what to remember. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.